Well, I would like to start our discussion on neonatal HFO. The topic we will discussing today are what is HFO and what are the different types of HFOs, especially the piston and diaphragm types, setting in HFO, and test lung simulation showing effects of HFO parameters, presentation of monitored data of patients managed with HFO, and finally, I would like to talk about the concept of using HFO. Now, everybody, what type of ventilation mode do you think
I would like
HFO
to start
is?
our discussion on neonatal HFO.
You may feel that it's a slightly special mode of gas exchange, different from a conventional ventilator,
topic we will discuss
which can exchange gases by ocean.
What is HFO
and what are the different types of HFOs, especially the piston and diaphragm.
To consider HFO,
We will first look at it in comparison of conventional CMV mode. As we all know, CMV provides artificial ventilation by delivering a set pressure or tidal volume for a set number of times. Its frequency can be several dozen times per minute, but in HFO, gas is being pumped in and out of the ventilator 10 times a second or so, very, very quickly. I will talk more about the pressure waveform in more detail. Compared to the CMV waveform shown in the upper row, the HFO waveform has a large number of waveforms, but the peak pressure supplied is lower. Nevertheless, the mean air pressure remains high. This is one of its special characteristics. Let's talk a little more about the HFO waveform. HFO is defined by the US FDA as a breathing frequency of 150 breaths or more per minute. 150 times per minute is 2.5 times per second or 2.5 Hertz. The orange level is the mean airway pressure, and the green pressure is the amplitude or delta P. The red area in the waveform is tidal volume. This tidal volume is smaller than the dead space and is one of the characteristics of ventilating with a very small ventilation volume. As you know, in CMV, you set respiratory rate, PAP, and tidal volume, inspiratory time, and PEEP. And HFO sets are frequency, amplitude or stroke volume, and MAP. Are these settings for ventilation purpose or to adjust oxygenation? This figure shows the mechanism of gas exchange in HFO. Ventilation is said to happen by a variety of events such as convection, diffusion, and pendlift. However, few people may have a correct understanding of these mechanisms.
This video shows the actual ventilation with HFO by filling the ventilator circuit with smoke. The smoke can be observed returning to the ventilator side while moving back and forth due to the change in pressure caused by HFO. Even with a small amount of tidal volume, we could observe by the smoke movement that ventilation is possible by using high-frequency movement. But it is still a matter of wonder why artificial ventilation is possible with this method.
Earlier, we talked about frequency. The number of breaths taken by an HFO is expressed in Hertz. At 10 Hertz, this corresponds to 10 times per second, or 600 times per minute. I actually checked it in slow motion. The ventilator was set to 15 Hertz. The test result shows that the test lung moved 15 times per second as per the 15 Hertz setting. Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. That's it. Please see the graph according to the market forecast for ventilators used for newborns on Research Drive website. The number of ventilators themselves will increase, among which more HFOs will be needed. In other words, market data predicts that our exposure to HFO will increase in the future. And this slide shows the classification of HFOs. High frequency positive pressure ventilator increase in frequency while in conventional mode, and high frequency jet ventilator, high pressure jet flow at high frequency. And the subject of our discussion today, high frequency oscillation ventilator, especially according to the type of drive like diaphragm and piston type, high frequency oscillation ventilators. Then, what is the difference between diaphragm type and piston type in HFO? The diaphragm type use the pressure created by the membrane oscillating back and forth at a high frequency.
To make it a little easier to understand, I will use the flow of water to explain. The flow of water produced by the shower is the steady flow in the HFO. The intensity of this flow is like map. The ruler represents the role of an oscillator, and its frequent movements create waves. This wave represents the pressure change of the HFO.
Next is piston type HFO. The colored part of the piston is the stroke volume in HFO. The speed at which the piston moves is the frequency. In HFO, the amplitude is the pressure created by the pumping motion of the piston. Using a toy to show the piston type, the amount of water in the toy syringe is the stroke volume. Pushing and pulling a syringe is the frequency in HFO, and waves are created in the same way as in the diaphragm type.
Let me summarize the differences in amplitude between diaphragm type and piston type. The piston type adjusts the amplitude by setting the volume in the syringe, and the time it takes to push the piston in and out, while the diaphragm type adjusts the amplitude by determining the speed and power with which the oscillator moves. As mentioned before, we have seen that the same HFO can have different amplitude characteristics depending on its driving type, right? Next, we will consider how to set up HFO. In this presentation, I will show you an experiment using a test model lung. Before I go any further, I'm sure you've all blown up balloons before. Imagine what it was like at that time. Balloons are difficult to inflate on the beginning, but after they are puffed up to a certain degree, it is easier to deflate them. In other words, if the balloon is deflated, compliance is poor. When the balloon is expanding, compliance is increasing. Here we can see actual ventilation with a test lung attached to the ventilator. First, when ventilated with CMV, compliance was 4.9 at low settings. But when PEEP and PIP were increased, compliance increased to 5.2. Similarly, for HFO, compliance was 0.12 at low settings, but increased to 0.15 when MAP was increased. Just as a balloon tends to become more inflated when it is blown up, we have confirmed that the compliance of both CMV and HFO changes with changes in pressure.
This video shows amplitude when only map is changed while stroke volume remains constant. You can see that the map value increases, the amplitude increases.
The following graph summarizes the changes in tidal volume when the map is changed. I believe that understanding the relationship between the two will help us to better understand what we are going to talk about. So please bear with me even though you may think I am repeating the same thing over and over again. This graph shows that the tidal volume changes as the map is increased, and that the larger the stroke volume, the larger the tidal volume. In other words, increasing map increases compliance, which means that the ventilation rate is greater even when the same pressure is supplied.
And next, I would like to discuss monitoring data in ventilator management. During mechanical ventilation, monitoring data is displayed on the ventilator continuously. The data is very eloquent. It can be evaluated not only in point of time, but also in time series.
The slide shows monitoring data for a baby born at 28 weeks of gestation and birth weight of 1,300 grams and ventilated with SIMV. After the start of ventilation, respiratory rate in the upper right is decreasing, tidal volume in the lower left is increasing, and compliance in the lower right is improving. So, the inspiration pressure from the ventilator is lowered, and then the map in the upper left is lowered. What do you think? The tidal volume decreased, and the respiratory rate increased as a result. After the pressure setting was tightened because of the elevation of respiratory rates, the tidal volume was increased again, and the respiratory rate was observed to be decreasing. Have you ever had difficulty adjusting ventilator settings even when all the physical findings, imaging data, and blood gas results are available? I myself am always struggling with ventilator management. Evaluation, quick response, and trending. These are three key words when using monitoring data related to ventilation. Everyone can evaluate them in the same way, and their value fluctuates dynamically and sensitively. Furthermore, it has the advantage of being able to be evaluated over time, not just at a certain point in time. I hope you can make good use of this information so that you can better manage your ventilator.
Well, let's change the subject a bit. We have all seen or heard that HFO is lung protective ventilation, but what is it really? Have you ever wondered? From here, I would like to talk a little bit about HFO being lung protective.
This image shows microscopic magnification of lung tissue undergoing ventilation to a normal rat and to a rat lung in the acute lung injury model. It can be observed that there is little change in alveoli size during inspiration and expiration in the left normal lung. Similarly, the HFO on the right does not appear to be overexpanded on inspiration or collapsed on expiration, whereas the CMV in the middle shows an image of overexpansion on inspiration or collapsed on expiration. Magnified image of the lungs is shown in the video. In the CMV on the left, you can see the alveoli expanded during inspiration, but collapsed during expiration. On the other hand, in HFO, even during exhalation, the lung expansion is preserved. Looking at the lung tissue, the HFO appeared to be more lung protective. But as you can see on the top of the image, it looks like there is more pressure on the HFO than on the CMV at the proximal flow sensor, and it also looks like pressure is being applied more often. So, why it can be said that HFO is lung protective? Actually, because of pressure damping, the pressure that reaches the peripheral lung tissue is attenuated until it is only slightly less than the pressure measured at the proximal flow sensor. On the other hand, the pressure reaching the peripheral lung tissue is kept high on CMV. Pressure damping is reproduced using the model test lung. An endotracheal tube was fitted in front of the model lung to test how tidal volume changes. First, the tidal volume was measured by connecting a 3 mm, 7 cm long tube. And then it can be seen that the tidal volume has been decreased when the tube length was replaced from 7 cm to 14 cm. In other words, it was confirmed that the tidal volume decreased as the airway became longer. Furthermore, when the tube diameters are reduced from 3 mm to 2.5 mm, the tidal volume is even smaller. In other words, the narrower the airway, the more the pressure decreases. HFO shows high pressure at the proximal. The schematic diagram shows that the pressure decreases as one moves toward the periphery due to the effect of airway resistance. Furthermore, the change in pressure is attenuated, but the mean airway pressure itself does not decrease, allowing the lungs to remain expanded. So far, we have talked about the ventilation mechanism of HFO and how HFO is lung protective ventilation. We have also discussed the importance of monitoring data by presenting the case of SIMV. From here, I would like to show you the actual monitoring data of a patient ventilated with HFO. First, Let me present a case of a patient born at 41 weeks of gestation, weighing 3,600 grams, who was placed on ventilator management for meconium aspiration syndrome and persistent pulmonary hypertension of the newborn. A 3.5 millimeters endotracheal tube was used for this patient. This patient's condition was severe and required a MAP of 23 for HFO management. Oxygen was also used at 100%, combined with nitric oxide inhalation therapy, and his condition gradually improved. As respiratory status improved, heart rate gradually improved, and CO2 decreased on blood gases. Also, we can see that the PF ratio is increasing as well. Physical findings and blood gas data during HFO showed improvement. How is HFO monitoring data related to the changes in the baby? This is the actual monitoring data of the baby. 17 hours after starting HFO, tidal volume has been increasing gradually, DCO2 increased as well. Compliance also has been increasing. Let's analyze the monitoring data in the areas highlighted in red. According to the improvement in ventilation condition, FiO2 could be reduced from 70% to 50%, although MAP and amplitude were not changed. Tidal volume was increasing with the implying of respiratory status. And also, dynamic compliance is improving for monitoring data. The HFO flow also confirms that the airflow rate required to inflate the lungs has been reduced. The relationship between the pressure supplied by the ventilator, lung compliance, and the tidal volume varies based on the lung dynamics. This relation is the same in HFO. The change in compliance and tidal volume as respiratory status improves is a very important change to monitor.
Okay, next. I would like to talk about volume guarantee.
First of all, what is the concept of volume guarantee? For CMV with pressure control, the deliver pressure is set, and the tidal volume is determined according to the pressure. In contrast, the volume guarantee is based on the concept of setting the desired tidal volume and supplying pressure appropriate to reach that setting. It is same in HFO. With a non-volume guaranteed HFO, the amplitude is set, and the tidal volume is supplied accordingly. But with a volume guarantee, the tidal volume is set and the amplitude is supplied accordingly. This can be simulated in a model test lung. If the mode is not volume guaranteed, the amplitude is constant. In this case, amplitude is set to 20. Even if the compliance of the model lung is made worse by hand, the pressure supplied by the ventilator is constant, so we can confirm that the tidal volume reaching the lungs is getting smaller. Next, let's examine the volume guarantee mode. Tidal volume was set to 3 milliliters. If the model test lung is not touched, the amplitude is in the low 20s. But if the model lung is held by hand to reproduce poor lung compliance, the amplitude increases to maintain a tidal volume of 3 milliliters. And then, after stopping simulation of low compliance with the model test lung, compliance improved, and amplitude decreased accordingly. In summary, with volume guarantee, the delivered pressure is constantly changing according to lung conditions. Different method to observe the changes in pressure observed during volume guarantee. The graph on the top shows how much pressure was needed for the attain the set tidal volume. The higher the map, the lower the amplitude, which means that the ventilation volume can be maintained at a lower pressure. The graph on the bottom shows the relation between stroke volume and map. As with amplitude, it has been shown that the higher the map, the less stroke volume is required to create tidal volume. Let's look at HFO from the perspective of the advanced closed-loop system concept in ventilators. There are automated systems using SpO2 and EtCO2, like ASV and SmartCare, or adaptive ventilation to respiratory efforts, like PAV and NAVA. I think that the concept of HFO with VG is similar to PAV and NAVA. What do you think? Let me show you the monitoring data of a baby managed by HFO with VG. We started ventilator management shortly after he was admitted to our NICU. We started with SIMV, but the CO2 was uncontrollable, so we switched to HFO at 4 hours of birth. The graphs show a rough transition of ventilator settings. MAP was started at 15, tidal volume at 3 milliliters, and oxygenation was temporarily increased to 70%, after which respiratory conditions improved. These graphs show the patient's heart rate and blood gases. Heart rate has decreased with improvement in ventilation condition, and CO2 levels are also decreasing. So, what about the monitoring data related to ventilation? Since this patient was ventilated on HFO with VG, that tidal volume is fixed, you know? We can observe nicely how the amplitude is gradually decreasing as compliance improves. Thus, the volume guarantee automatically reduces the pressure gradually so that the appropriate pressure can be always maintained. In addition, there was very interesting change on this patient. Let's look at the monitoring data immediately after the HFO change, highlighted in red. In fact, the trending monitoring data immediately after switch to HFO for this baby was shown in this figure. The map was lowered based on the judgment that the patient's ventilatory condition was improving. The tidal volume was also lowered, resulting in a drop in SpO2. After that, the oxygen level, map, and tidal volume were increased again. To help to understand the situation, instead of having one graph for each parameter, I made the following graph showing map, amplitude, and tidal volume together. The graph including the 3 parameters makes easy to monitor the changes. Although the map is lowered and the tidal volume is lowered to indicate that oxygenation and ventilation have improved, the actual amplitude has increased, indicating that more pressure from the ventilator was needed. Subsequently, increased map and tidal volume did not immediately decrease amplitude. Higher FiO2 was needed, and nitric oxide inhalation therapy was required. we added chest x-rays to this monitoring data transition. The x-ray taken at the time the map was lowered did not show any improvement in lung size compared to the x-ray taken when the respiratory status improved. Thus, the monitoring data provides information about the baby's breathing dynamically in a sensitive and subtle way, and over time. This slide shows the settings to be made to piston type and diaphragm HFO ventilators and the corresponding monitoring items. In diaphragm, mode without volume guarantee, set amplitude and monitor tidal volume. In volume guarantee, set tidal volume and monitor amplitude changes. If it is a piston type, we need to set the stroke volume and evaluate how much the amplitude will be, and consequently the tidal volume.
Okay, now I'd like to discuss the map for a moment. How to determine the appropriate map in HFO.
This is the reference from a textbook on neonatal ventilation management. It is written that map value should be set 2 to 3 centimeters H2O higher than the setting of CMV. Other papers on HFOs also make similar statements. A slightly higher airway pressure than during CMV is associated with adequate lung recruitment. Next, we will discuss MAP in terms of carbon dioxide concentration, not oxygenation. In an experiment using model test lung, an EtCO2 sensor is inserted in front of the model lung to measure the value of carbon dioxide. And a small amount of carbon dioxide is continuously flowing from the CO2 tank. MAP 10, with a stroke volume of 11, the CO2 value was around 23.5. Later, when the MAP was set to 13, the CO2 value dropped to around 22.6, although the stroke volume setting was not changed. In actual patients, we expect to improve oxygenation by increasing MAP. And then, by increasing MAP improves lung compliance. This result shows that setting MAP to an appropriate value improves oxygenation, but also improves ventilation because tidal volume improves as compliance improves. Even the slightest change in tidal volume will decrease CO2 concentration.
Okay, now let's think about the leaks. In ventilator management of neonates, in consideration of airway damage, we allow for some leakage around the endotracheal tube while performing ventilatory management. In HFO, how does the leak affect ventilation?
On the left, we can see CMV graphs, while on the right side, the HFO graphs. CMV shows a marked decrease in tidal volume on the expiratory side as leakage increases. On the other hand, the HFO data on the right side of the diagram shows that even with increased leakage, the decrease in tidal volume is not as large as for CMV. Similar to the previous graph, minute ventilation is also markedly reduced in CMV, but HFO shows only a slight decrease in DCO2, a measure of ventilation. The data presented here shows that the effect of leakage is not zero for HFO, but it may be taken to be less susceptible to leakage than CMV.
And next, let's consider resistance from data using model lung.
Forceps were used to add resistance to the endotracheal tube connecting the ventilator to the model test lung. As a result, you can see that the tidal volume has decreased and the amplitude has increased. You see the bread man on the balloon swinging. He is a character that appears in the Japanese anime on Ponman. The bread man is peace-loving. You can see the bread man's swing become smaller with the balloon with the resistance attached. It can be said that tidal volume is reduced in case of pathologies associated with airway resistance. So how do you actually change the ventilator settings when the target tidal volume is not reached? One way to do this is to increase stroke volume, which increases the pressure supplied by the ventilator, resulting in an increase in tidal volume. A further option is to lower the frequency. For the same stroke volume, the amplitude is reduced because the piston is ejected for a longer time. By supplying pressure over time at a lower pressure, tidal volume increases. Of course, raising the map to increase lung compliance is also an option. However, in a situation where the map is somewhat high, raising the map higher than that may not change the tidal volume much. For example, the same tidal volume can be increased using various parameters such as map, stroke volume, amplitude, frequency, and so on. Let's try changing the frequency a little more precisely. When frequency is changed from 15 Hz to 10 Hz and 6 Hz, amplitude decreases and tidal volume increases. In other words, if the target tidal volume cannot be reached, lowering the frequency can be very useful. Amplitude goes down and tidal volume goes up. If the power produced by the ventilator is limited, it is easier to control the tidal volume by reducing the frequency. This is the reason why reducing frequency is recommended to adjust the tidal volume. The ventilator power is basically the difference why patients can be managed at 15 Hz with the humming, while with VN 500 you will need to use 10 to 12 Hz instead. Let's reconsider the ventilation and oxygenation proposed at the beginning of this discussion. As I have indicated many times, the concept of compliance is very important in HFO. As for oxygenation and CMV, in addition to PEEP and FiO2, I think delivered pressure and inspiratory time also play a role. Oxygenation in HFO will involve MAP and FiO2. As for ventilation, CMV will be related to delivered pressure and respiratory rate, as well as inspiratory time and PEEP. Similarly, for HFO, MAP as well as frequency and amplitude affect ventilation. Ventilation mechanisms in HFO are also based on respiratory physiology. Compliance is calculated by dividing the ventilation volume by the delivered pressure. In HFO, compliance is the tidal volume divided by amplitude. I have shown that compliance increases when MAP is raised in the balloon model. In response to the increase in compliance, the tidal volume increases. In other words, MAP affects ventilation as well as oxygenation. There is a lot of information hidden in this formula. Relation between MAP and compliance, as well as tidal volume and amplitude. I believe that constant awareness of these relationships will lead to better ventilatory management.
In summary, today's discussion included basic description of HFO, importance of monitoring data, monitoring data of babies ventilated with HFO, volume guarantee, leaks, resistance, and frequency. It is very useful to keep in mind that respiratory management based on respiratory physiology is not limited to HFO. I hope that my talk today has been of some help to you and that it will help your patient ventilatory management. Thank you very much for attending this webinar.
Thank you, Dr. Takahashi. First of all, please accept our apologies for the change of the link due to technical problems. We really apologize. The recording of this webinar will be uploaded and notified to the registered mail. If you have any questions, we accept them later by mail.
Rất cảm ơn tiến sĩ bác sĩ Takahashi đã trình bày ngày hôm nay. Nội dung ngày hôm nay sẽ được record và sẽ được gửi đến các cái mail đã được đăng ký trước đó. Ngoài ra, nếu quý vị có câu hỏi thêm thì quý vị cứ việc gửi lại câu hỏi và tiến sĩ bác sĩ Takahashi sẽ trả lời bằng email đến quý vị.